This might be the worst rare book valuation I've ever seen.
Shakespeare's comedies, tragedies, and histories.
Because if this book is what they say it is, it's not worth 10 times what they value it at.
This book dates to 1623.
And it's not worth 100 times what they value it at. It's worth 10,000 times their valuation.
This book has a secondary market value about...
Today we're going to watch this video, How to Value Antique Books by Dr. Laurie. And as an antiquarian bookseller myself, someone who deals in rare books and manuscripts for a living, I saw this video, saw it had 200,000 views, and thought we could check it out together.
The Last Days of Pompeii by Lord Lytton. Hey, excellent! But the book itself is relatively well known and famous from the latter part of the 1800s.
I mean, Lytton's Last Days of Pompeii was a very popular book back in the 1800s, but it's very out of fashion now. It's not a good seller at all. It was first published by Richard Bentley in 1834 in 3 volumes and was then published in loads of different formats as it remained popular throughout the 19th and even into the early 20th century. And this copy that we're looking at isn't from the 1800s, it's from the 1900s. We can tell that because of the publisher's binding. It's got that pictorial onlay, that colour picture that's pasted onto the front cover, and you don't really see those on publishers' bindings until the early 1900s.
Okay, and your particular book has a secondary market value of about $200 and you pay 10 cents. Excellent.
I mean, I suppose 10 cents is a cheap price to pay for any book, but there is no way that this book is worth $200. A copy of the first edition from 1834 might be a couple $100, but the fact that a first edition is only a couple of $100 tells you how sort of popular and sought after this book is. Just a general second-hand copy of this book that's 100 or so years old, you know, you might get $10 or $20 for it, but no more than that.
Illustrations by Maxfield Parrish, the great Philadelphia artist and illustrator. How did you acquire this book?
Shopping with my husband. He is the book connoisseur.
Oh, your husband's the book guy.
Okay, nice. This might be a proper book. It's Maxfield Parrish's edition of the Arabian Nights. It was published by Scribner's in 1909. It's a lovely book, has illustrated end papers, a decorative title page, and 12 colour plates by Parrish.
So I'm looking at this book, and this is the Arabian Nights, and it's got decorated end papers. These are called end papers. It's got a little bit of tanning. We've got the 1909 publication date.
Okay, and we can't see the copyright statement in this copy, which should say 1909, and if it does, it's obviously not a first edition of the Arabian Nights, but it might be the first Maxfield Parrish edition. And if they're not going to show us any more to confirm for sure, let's proceed on that assumption that it is the first Parrish edition.
Is it a first edition?
They swear it is.
Who swears it is?
The connoisseur.
Who's a connoisseur?
My husband.
Oh, your husband swears it is. Are we still listening to him? How many years you been listening to him?
That's weirdly aggressive, isn't it? But anyway, this is probably or possibly a first edition based on what they've shown us.
And he makes sure that when they're on that bookshelf that they're not upright like a soldier. He makes sure that they're on their side.
It depends.
It doesn't depend, baby. If he's such a connoisseur, he better lay those books down.
I mean, that isn't right either. It does depend, but in almost all cases, it's perfectly safe to store books, as you can see behind me, and as you'll see in every library and important private collection in the world, to store books upright, the way they were designed to be stored. You might, in a couple of examples, if a book has particularly weak hinges, or if the text block of the book is heavier than the covers that hold it, decide to store a book flat. So collectors might do this with a book like the first edition of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes or the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, because these books have quite heavy text blocks and the hinges that hold the books together are often too weak for them, so it's safer to store those books lying down where there's no stress at all on the spines. But like I say, this is the exception, it's not a rule.
The book I'm holding in my hand is worth $3,000. Your connoisseur says it's worth $75. You need a new connoisseur.
She really doesn't like this woman's husband, does she? But in this case, the husband is far closer in the valuation than she is. Even if it is a first edition, it isn't a $3,000 book. Even if it was signed by Maxfield Parrish, which it isn't, it wouldn't be a $3,000 book. You could go online today and buy a dozen or so copies of this book in better condition for a couple $100. Literally No more than that. So far in this video, we've just seen a bit of waving a book around in the air and then plucking a random number out of the air as a valuation, which doesn't make me particularly confident for the book we're going to look at next.
Marbleized end papers. This is marbling. This is what they did in the 1700s. How'd you acquire this? What made you buy it?
Okay, we've got a folio here, which means a big book of that size as opposed to, say, an octavo, which would be your standard-sized hardback book. And as she opens it up there and shows us the end papers, it's got me thinking that this is a 19th century book based on the pattern of those end papers. And also the spine on the binding looks like it's probably 19th century to me.
Shakespeare's Comedies, Tragedies, and Histories. Published according to true original copies, 1623. You bought this at an estate sale?
I don't know if you know the significance of what she just said, because she just read out, word for word, what appears on the title page of one of the most valuable books in the world. Because that is exactly what it says on the title page of the Shakespeare First Folio, a $10 million book. Now she has my attention, but there's one caveat we need to be aware of here. This could be an original copy of the First Folio from 1623, but equally it could be a 19th century facsimile or copy or reproduction of it. These were produced in the 19th century from 1807 onwards. So we've got to detect, are we talking about the real thing or are we talking about a later copy? We'll have to look closer to find out.
Strong spine, marbleized end papers, as I showed you before. And also what you have is what's called a Cambridge.
We're getting a closer look at the binding here, and it does look to me at least like this could be a 19th century reproduction of an earlier binding, which might tilt the scales towards this being a copy rather than the real thing. But that said, even when you look at copies of the real First Folio that were rebound in the 19th century, often they were rebound to look much earlier, so this isn't really giving us a clue either way at this stage.
In perfect condition. You don't have every volume, just have one.
That's incorrect. There should only be one volume here, and it's not until much later that you get Shakespeare's plays published in collected editions that take up multiple volumes.
Only look for publication mark. You have to look for whether or not a true and important author like Shakespeare is going to actually show you one in an early edition.
Well, no, that's not right either. If this is what she has read out, it's the first ever collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. The first time they were published in one volume. And not only that, it's the first time that about half of those plays had ever been published at all. So this is an extremely important book.
So most of his editions are, of course, the 1500s. By the early 1600s, you have people who are copying his editions. That's what you have here.
And no, that's not true either. Only 8 of Shakespeare's plays were published in the 1500s. The whole point of the First Folio, the whole point and purpose of this book is that Shakespeare's plays weren't published and preserved separately in his own lifetime. But despite her being wrong about the publishing history of Shakespeare's plays, it does still sound like she's convinced this book that we're looking at is from 1623.
This book dates to 1623. Did you pay more than $500 for this book? This book has a secondary market value about $1,200.
Okay, so she's valued the book at $1,200. If it's the real thing, then it's $10 million. If it's a 19th century facsimile in quite nice condition, which this looks like, then it's probably more like a couple $1,000s. And I think we can work out which one it is, and we're going to work it out by looking at these end papers here. And what I'm interested in here is not the end papers themselves. The end papers, as I've said, are 19th century. The binding, as I've said, is 19th century. But a 19th century binding and 19th century end papers can still hold within them a book printed in the 1600s. It just means that it's been rebound a couple hundred of years later. What we're going to look at instead are these catalogue clippings right here. And sometimes collectors would paste these catalogue descriptions into their books to track their value in the market and help other people identify them. So we're looking for dates and publishers, and if we read the top one here, it's a bit fuzzy, but it says Shakespeare William, Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories and Tragedies, published according to the true original copies, 1623, which isn't a bad start. It then says, with the Drushut portrait folio and then describes the binding. All of that information would be consistent with the catalogue description of the first folio. But if we keep reading the description, we can see something in square brackets at the end of the description, and that is Wright 1807, and then lower down we can see E and J Wright 1807, and again down again E and J Wright 1807. So this confirms that it almost certainly isn't an original copy of the Shakespeare First Folio, and that it wasn't printed as they said it was in 1623.
This book dates to 1623.
But this is still an interesting and valuable book in its own right. And that's because 1807, known as the E and J Wright facsimile, is the first ever facsimile edition of the First Folio. Countless reproductions have been made in the 200 years since this, but this was the first one that attempted to do it accurately. And it's possible to tell the difference between a facsimile and an original copy because in assembling the facsimile, the printers made a reported 368 errors in transcribing and printing copies of the original. And not only can you tell it's a facsimile by the errors, you can tell it by the paper. 17th century paper will feel very different in your hands to 19th century paper, but not only that, paper used in this first facsimile edition of the Shakespeare First Folio has a special watermark in it. So after all that, I'm not sure the appraiser gave us anything interesting or true about this book, but we aren't left with a $10 million copy of the Shakespeare First Folio. But we are still left with something very interesting, the first facsimile edition of 1807. Please subscribe and comment below if you want to see more books like this, and I'll see you next time.